Okay, so the first session for the day is Timeless Lessons from Business Biographies. In fact, Ralph Waldo Emerson says that to be in a world which is trying to make something different out of yourself and being you and maintaining that integrity, that's an extremely difficult task. Right? Which is essentially what greatness is all about. You have been integral to what you have been. And in this session, we are trying to figure out what are these timeless lessons from business biographies. And I've got two stalwarts along with me, Ajay Nanavati and Professor G.Raghuram. Professor G.Raghuram is the director of IIM Bangalore. And I would pass on the mic to each one of them before they start the session to say a few words about themselves. Rather than I think I wouldn't really do the justice of introducing them. So it would be better that they introduce themselves. And I'm also joined by Ajay Nanavati, who was earlier the managing director of 3M. So my first question, and immediately after you introduce yourself, would be, what is business biography after all, right? Is there any difference between a normal biography and a business biography, right? Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Sangeeth. So first of all, I'm not sure why I'm on this panel. I guess it must be because of the gray hair, undyed gray hair, probably. But having said that, I think I guess the only perspective that I can really provide is the fact that I have, over the last 25 years, lived in 6 cities, 4 countries, 3 continents. So I guess the only sort of perspective that I can bring to the table is sort of a perspective which is not necessarily India-centric. But in response to your query, I think this whole concept of sort of business biographies, at least, has been around for a while in the West. You see a lot of it coming out of the West. But I think in India, it's of more recent origin. And I think, as you alluded, typically what it tends to be, one of the things that I've always felt is the difference between business biographies to me, for example, one of my favorite business biographies is the book called Who Says Elephants Can't Dance? The reason why I picked that particular book, because for me, what business biographies really are is about transformation. I think that to me is one of the key essences that kind of differentiates personal biographies, which are sort of stories of what one has been through, whereas I find business biographies to be really about transformation. And I tend to find business biographies to be less glorified than personal biographies, in the sense that there is a tendency to be a little bit more candid. You talk about your mistakes as well as your successes. It's not all motherhood and apple pie. And I think that's that to me is the distinction between a individual's biography and a business-related biography. That to me is really the essence of the difference between the two.
And what do you think is the real difference between a normal biography and business biography? Is there any difference at all? And do we really need to distinguish between that? Should there be, from a publishing perspective, should there be a separate genre at all for as far as business is concerned?
Hi. So I introduce myself first. Sure. Yeah. Hi, I'm Raghuram, and I know why I'm here. It's very simple. I mean, IIM Bangalore, I think, is some sort of a partner for this, and I have a role play here. So thank you anyway for the opportunity. So, I think business biographies would be different. I was just thinking in terms of my own recollection of biographies. Of course, so much has been written on Gandhi, but very influential for me, starting from his autobiography and then reading some of his biographies. And then I think I read a book, a biography on Thomas Bata. He is actually a Czechoslovak, not at that time, from maybe the Czech side, and then somehow found his way, traveling and did what he did, largely in India. And so the way coming from the poor not so well-off family and influencing or building business organizations, affecting business, I mean maybe management in a broader sense. I think so. It's a specific sort of genre, as you said. That's what I would say. So, Gandhi would fit the broader sort of biography. While I think there are people, and the way it gets written about how they had an influence in terms of the certain economic impact, organizational impact.
So what you're essentially saying is that the minute it is a business biography, there is an organization building which is happening over there, right? So you're building up organizations compared to a normal biography. Say in the case of Mahatma Gandhi, again, probably there could have been an organization building which is happening, right? So it might not be a traditional business organization as such, but there was still an organization building. Is that what you mean by this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess Gandhi's built many organizations, values, but that's true even in business biographies. So I would only distinguish it as something that's, where the larger impact is economic, managerial, business organizations.
Right. So, and you were mentioning about the Thomas Bata biography.
Yeah.
What is it that, is there anything specific which you took away from that? Is there anything which helped you in the latter stages?
Well, yeah, I think that a person who's also not so well off, and at a time when Europe was in turmoil, I remember one of his own lessons where his father, to make him a well-grounded person, I think he was just 9 when he was taken up to some place many hundreds of kilometers away, and was told that he has to find his way home with, very small amount of money, more as a test of his mettle or building, and some independence. So, of course, I don't recall too many details, but I know when, I read the book, I was quite impressed by, and then, of course, what he's kind of achieved and what he set up in terms of the leather industry and consumer orientation, shoes, and yeah.
And you were mentioning about Who Says Elephants Can't Dance, and if I remember right, it was an IBM autobiography. Absolutely, Lou Gessner. So how has that impacted you at all? So in fact, Raghu was mentioning during the inauguration time that his defining moment probably has been the Napoleon biography, right? So did anything did it bring over to you a defining moment, or was that a passing biography or a passing business biography which you read? Especially since you went on to lead a company like 3M, which is again a stalwart in terms of manufacturing. So how did it impact you?
Yeah, so I think to me what was really impactful, and we were at that juncture ourselves as an organization going through a transformation from a sort of an old world bricks and mortar industrial organization. We were going through that transition, and I still remember I had just moved to Singapore from Bangalore at that time, and to me the two key takeaways out of that was the fact that Lucas came out of a consulting background, who had no prior experience in industrial in the business side of the world. Really, there were two takeaways. One is that really it's not necessarily that you have to be from a particular world to be able to make change happen. And the other big learning was that here was a iconic company which had reached outstanding heights and then was on the verge of collapse. And so to be able to, and I use that analogy even in the context of my own company, that it's like trying to shift the Titanic. You know, when you try to move the Titanic, it's a very slow process to be able to change direction for a big ship. And I think that was the other transformation, was that how he was able to drive that transformation to take something which is got deep history and then make it change direction is not an easy task. And it applies as much in the personal environment. So those were the two takeaways, that you really didn't have somebody who was organically grown within the organization, who came in from the outside. And again, in our own company, we've had a history of organic leaders, except for one situation where we brought in an outside leader, and actually it was not a great success. So I think that how a corporate culture, it really taught me about corporate culture, and how deeply ingrained it is, and how you can, what it takes to really change culture within an organization. And the other book that had a great impact on me was the book called Only the Paranoid Survive by Andy Grove from Intel. Another classic case study, if you want to call it that, about how an individual, in his case, who built the company and how they really, as I said, I keep coming back to that word transformation. To me, that's the essence of a business, is how do you transform? How do you drive change? You know, and whereas, as I said, individual biographies tend to be more focused on a journey. They tend to be more about a journey rather than an inflection point where you sort of trigger change. That, to me, those are the two learnings from those two, to me, great business leaders.
I love that part where you explained specifically about where you're trying to bring out the difference between a business versus a normal kind of an atmosphere. So if my learning is correct, in the case of a business, you have kind of a closed box, right? So you have a corporate setup, you have the rules and regulations which are defined by the corporate as such. So you can't really be so radical as such, right? So at some point of time, I was in fact researching on Mahatma Gandhi, and why did Indians as such choose Gandhi instead of somebody else, like a Subhash Chandra Bose, for example, right? So if you really look at that person, who has got a better chance of delivering us the freedom? One is a very stern, ironclad man, right, in a military uniform, versus somebody who is a half-naked fakir, as Winston Churchill would say, right? Who has got a better chance of giving us freedom, right? I would say, I would place my bet on Mr. Bose, right? But why did we end up choosing Mahatma Gandhi? And I would say it is probably because it's not the leader who ends up choosing the followers, but probably it is the followers who ends up choosing the leader in a normal environment, right? What was India like? India probably could have resonated more with a Mahatma Gandhi, who is a half-naked man, who is professing satyagraha, which was very integral to India as such, compared to somebody who was using a military might, which was probably slightly more alien to us. So probably in an outside culture, it's a followers who end up selecting the leader, right? Compared to a very tight setup, right? Like a corporate atmosphere, wherein the leaders are very artificially selected, and then they could probably figure out the culture, figure out things which within that box. So the question which I have for you, sir, is that how much could there be an individual contribution as such, as far as business biographies are concerned? Because essentially, if you really look into any biography, there could be two characters. One is a Don Quixote, which is about our egos, right? Which is essentially what his biography is all about, right? As in, how do I really project my ego out there? And the second one is the Sancho Panza, which is more rustic, which is more earthy part of it. How do you really figure out the real individual contribution, whether it is a Thomas Bata is concerned or whether it is Sir Thomas Watson is concerned?
sorry, I'm going to move away from Thomas Bata and, well, actually, I want to play to something that I have been reading about. So both in the context of Indian business history and the biography, and that's in the context of Indian railways. So, well, I think the railways have, in terms of the business history, maybe more so in the last maybe 70 odd years. Lots of books have been coming up, maybe, you know, after railways hit 100 in 1953. And there are some very good books, excellent stories. Of course, Ruskin Bond and others writing stories around railways. But in terms of documenting business history on multiple dimensions, I think Indian Railways is one that does well. At least I've been tracking that. But in terms of biographies, it's very interesting that as maybe this large government organization, there's often not room for individuals to stand out. So in fact, I think the first biography ever, you know, which might move into a, you know, literary domain other than some individuals who might on their own pen, you know, or have somebody pen a little bit about them, is that of Mr. Sridharan, E. Sridharan. And I think it's interesting to see why, you know, now there are already 2 biographies that have come out about Sridharan. The latest one is, well, Rajendra Aklekar, who interestingly had another book which, not in the Biz Fest, but I think the Bangalore Lit Fest had a nomination called Halt Station India, where, you know, he's really discovering the railways and Mumbai. You know, those are his 2 passions. He's actually a journalist, and now he's written a biography on Sridharan. Now, for me, of course, see, I personally know Mr. Sridharan. I mean, well, my father also happened to be in railways, and they were colleagues. So to me, he was like Sridharan Mama. And then, you know, we've sort of, I've seen him in his, in those avatars which get talked about. But I think one of the things that makes him a personality worth writing about is not just the Delhi Metro or the Konkan Railway Corporation. Or I think it's also, you know, that he talks about Gita, he espouses values. He talks about, you know, a certain routine that he follows in the day. He, you know, talks about yoga. So I think it starts giving a larger than life, you know, image of a person. In fact, if I get into the biography and knowing him, and also having studied Konkan Railway Corporation out of my own interest, Delhi Metro out of my own interest, you know, I can see a lot of the, you know, overstatement that tends to happen. You know, people like to make things, I think, apocryphal, you know, as it keeps growing. So, but anyway, it's interesting. I mean, when I read, and I hope there is a lot to learn about Mr. Sridharan, at least for, you know, a lot of good things that he's done. So,
yeah, so I love the way you have narrated the turnaround of the Indian railways as such. So, which again brings me back to that same question about if it's a larger realm. So if we go back to the sociologist Max Weberian kind of a thing. So you've got a charismatic leadership versus you've got a very bureaucratic leadership. So probably in the case of an Indian Railways, or probably even in the case of IBM, we might be talking more about a bureaucratic leadership, right? Compared to a very charismatic kind of a leadership, right? What is your opinion about that? So how much can you be transformative rather than transactional in a corporate setup?
So again, you know, I've had, you know, everybody's heard the stories about Jack Welch, for example, from GE. I come from a culture where we don't have rock star CEOs. Ours is a very sons of the soil kind of a culture out in the Midwest, getting up at 4 o'clock and going and milking the cows, and, farmers and Scandinavian immigrants. So I've grown up in a culture where we don't have a rock star CEO, and in fact, I recently did a analysis of the two corporations over a 50-year horizon as to how one performed versus how the other performed. And it was clear that we were more sort of about building an institution that outlives the individual. And I think that's one of the challenges we have in India often. We tend to glorify our leaders, and we make them holier than thou. And they're like sort of flawless people. And so to me, it's always been about building something that will outlast you. And that's the legacy you look to leave behind. And that's, again, the difference that I find between individual biographies and business biographies. I think business biographies, at least the ones that I refer to, are willing to admit some of the mistakes they made. Whereas in individual biographies, it's all about successes, and you use the word ego a lot. But it's really, and I find them to be much more linear in the sense that this happened, I moved to this, I moved to that, I moved to that. It's much more of a linear story, whereas in business biographies there tend to be much more ups and downs associated with the journey. So in summary, I really believe that, in the Indian context, it's really something we need to look at, is this sort of glorification of leaders, whether it be in the business realm or in the political realm, as these sort of flawless individuals. And I think that some of these stories that I alluded to talks about the mistakes they made. To me, reading a biography is more about the learning from the mistakes than the learnings from the successes. That, how did you bounce back? And I've always sort of been fond of touting the underdog. Even whether it's a tennis match, I'm always rooting for the underdog. It's just sort of in my DNA. So that kind of is my view, is that we need to be migrating more to a culture of institution building. And I think that railway analogy is a good analogy too, about building we are all sort of specks in time passing through, and 3M, the company that I spent 30 years with, is a 130-year-old company, and it is still ranked today as one of the highest, most ethical companies in the world, the most innovative companies in the world, one of the best companies in terms of shareholder return over a 150-year horizon. So when I hear these stories about these, sort of the blazing stars, and I think that's something that we need to be cautious about. Getting kind of philosophical out.
In fact, we would be winding up in another 5 minutes. There's this question which I've been dying to ask you, especially since you are an expert in the Indian Railways part of it. Which is essentially about, so you have a transformative leader probably in terms of the ministry part of it, right? So several of them are somebody like a Lalu Prasad Yadav claiming to have transformed the railways as such, right? And then you have the bureaucrats which actually run the system, right? Whom do you really attribute it to for going to the next level as such? Is it the bureaucrats which run the system, or is there a transformative leader, whether it's a Suresh Prabhu or whether it's a Lalu Prasad Yadav? What's your opinion about it?
Yeah. So, well, given the way Indian Railways is set up, first, I'm not sure you are ever going to be able to point fingers either way. I think it's a combination of at the highest level, the railway board, and equally the railway minister. See, in fact, Suresh Prabhu, for all the, goodness of a person with a certain vision and energy, I am not sure, he put his fingers in the right places to get railways moving. For example, railways are highly departmentalized, while a lot of investments need to cut across departments. And Mr. Prabhu, at least in my view, tended to play more of an external role which was important. I mean, he needed to bring in funds, he needed to ward off the political pressures on prioritization of projects and so on. But I think railways also needed a certain internal perspective, where that much required integration across departments. See, the chairman railway board is usually a bird of passage. You know, you've got 2 years to retire, a year and a half to retire. You really can't strategize. And the minister needs to play a role. Lalu Prasad, interestingly, for all his other, you know, whatever else is talked of him, I think he understood this part, and he had, of course, though he directly did not do it, I think he had an excellent civil servant who supported him and could sort of cut across these departments and get a lot of initiatives going. So I think there was a transformative element at that time, more because Lalu had, you know, he didn't want to get into it. He got the right person, and yet he knew what needed to be done. Or, you know, and maybe Madhav Rao Scindia at one time was, so anyway, that's the nature of railways. And so interestingly, Sridharan, though he rose to being a member engineering, which is the highest that he could have risen, of course, maybe chairman railway board is a higher position. Actually, you know, a lot of what is attributed to him is his post-superannuated career, right? When he first came to Konkan Railway as a superannuated railway officer, creating a new organization, and then, given the success of Konkan Railway, moving on to Delhi Metro. Though, of course, I think again he may not have done everything right. Though, you know, unfortunately, the biography does not bring out that. For example, the airport line is a failure, which was done under a public-private partnership, not because the public-private partnership could not have been successful, but because Mr. Sridharan philosophically did not believe in public-private partnerships and dragged his feet, even though Sheila Dikshit, the chief minister then, said we must do it on a PPP mode. And you know, that created, and the PPP structuring was a failure, and then Reliance had to pull out, and you know, it's one of those white elephants that we have today. So anyway, but I want to add one thing, given you know, the rest of the day. Well, talking of biographies, I want to add our own Raghu here, in his book, Beyond the Call of Duty, you know, when he talks about those wonderful Britishers, well, you know, you must listen to Sashi Tharoor, by the way. So anyway, you know, he at least picks up a few Britishers and says that they have done so much good to India. I'm not so sure, at least, but there is one chapter of Robert Stephenson and John Chapman, who were very instrumental in the early development of the railways in India, which Raghu talks of in one of his chapters, and in fact, as a tribute to that, his cover page actually of that book is a, you know, locomotive, which of course attracted me more to read his book, at least that one. So, you know, but these guys, I don't think maybe some of your other heroes did it out of, I don't know, goodness to India, but I think these guys were simply there for commercial value. And I want to mention one thing which today Mr. Nitin Gadkari would not be happy listening to, and that is Robert Stephenson, when he saw coal being moved from the eastern India, the Raniganj coal fields to Kolkata for consumption, he said it was moving in a slow and expensive way along the Damodar River, inland water transport. And he says, I think rail technology will come and, you know, we can save time and cost, and that's what they did. The first East Indian Railway line from Kolkata to Raniganj. Today, you know, we're talking about inland water transport has to take over from railways and road and, you know, climate impact and so on. So anyway, that's one. Just, what's that, EP timeout? Yeah. So the other is, I just want to bring up an interesting book in terms of railway history, Bibek Debroy, which is sort of a more his discovery of railways while he was on a committee that had been appointed. But what is interesting is the book tries to pitch itself with an introduction by one of our speakers later in the day, that's Gurcharan Das, who was, you know, I think himself probably a railway aficionado, right? So he's written a very nice chapter in this book, which, so anyway, in terms of people who you may talk to later in the day about railways but coming back, Sridharan is today the only biography worth anything on railways. For such a large organization with such a long history, there are people who have done things in railways, but it's useful to reflect why he stands out. Yeah.
Sangeeth, one second, since I'm the author of the book, and especially with Shashi Tharoor, I must make a statement here. Because the whole question is about history versus biography. I'm not a historian, right? Take a mic. Since the whole question is about history versus biography, and I'm not a historian by a far shot, the book was not about history at all. The book was not even about any Britisher having done any good to India. The book only talked about some youngsters at the age of 17 and 18 as subalterns to East India Company coming to India, taking 4 months to travel, landing up in a land where people didn't look like them, didn't dress like them, didn't talk their language, had different gods, had different festivals, where one communication home and back would take 6 months to and fro. And a 17, 18-year-old kid, not knowing that somebody, a Raghunathan, will write a chapter in a book about him, does amazing things. And at his level, he's not even sure that he's doing any great thing for British India or anything of the kind. So the whole question was one of, today when I interview a management trainee, he says, oh sir, my parents are in Bangalore, I want a job in Bangalore. These kids came where there were no roads, they had to do their own surveys, there were no aircrafts and no engines, they had to make all of them. So the book is about that inspiration. As I said, biographies can be inspirational depending on a purpose. So I set the record straight on that. The difference according to me between biography and business history, in history, as I said in a boring way, the underwears are worn under the trousers, as it should be. But when it comes to a biography, Superman, the underwears are worn over the trousers. Okay, that's exactly the difference between the two. But if you really want to know the difference, read this amazing book. I'm sure many of you would have read it, The Emperor of Maladies by Siddharth Bhattacharjee. He says, I started writing the history of cancer, but I ended up making it a biography of cancer because cancer has a personality like human beings have a personality. Cancers can be aggressive, cancers can be passive. One cancer reacts to chemotherapy in one way, another cancer reacts to chemotherapy in a different way. So it's almost as if it's a live organism with a personality of its own. So he converted midway as he was writing history into a biography. That book is a good study to know the difference between what history is and what a biography is. Sorry.
Thank you so much, sir. So just winding up the session, though Ajay started up with saying he has got no clue why he is there in the session, at the end of the session, I'm convinced why you are in the session, as well as you said. Right? It was a fabulous session. So my takeaways from this were primarily two. One is we discussed about what is really the difference between a large playing field, open playing field biography versus kind of a closed box business biography as such. The second one, which you also delved on, was about one great man versus several people building an institution, which you also delved about. Right? Thank you very much for your time. I deeply appreciate the time. I hope you enjoyed the session. We are stepping into the next session. Thank you very much, sir.